Hello and welcome back to the ROI podcast. We're here today. We're talking about Millay miracle, the unraveling, dwarves hiding in closets, stealing vote counts, and all other things macro and policy. There's only one man we can turn to for guidance in such circumstances. And of course, it is the bow-tied Mara. The Mara, it's safe to say quite a bit has happened over the last week. A bit have happened since we've spoken to each other. What's been on
Yeah,
your radar this week, particularly with the recent election results in Argentina that did in fact involve a dwarf?
yeah, there was actually a dwarf arrested who was stealing ballots. Whenever people walked out of the room, he would come in and grab some ballots away or swap them out. So that dwarf was dutifully arrested and taken into custody. But yeah, besides that, it didn't really help in terms of getting Milei's party a better result in the local Buenos Aires province elections, which was mainly due to the whole corruption scandal around his sister and the fact that their alliance with the PRO, so that's Macri's party, didn't really work out as planned in terms of not setting it up correctly. So basically, it was just very loosely done, also by Milei's sister and Sebastián Pareja. They were the two in charge of creating the lists and picking the candidates. And, there were a lot of candidates. Looks like, candidacies were also just, bought and sold. And there were a lot of Kirchnerites on the ballots. Delay in the process of the getting to the elections also made a little bit of fun on about the pro, etc. So that was all in all not very positive if you want 40 plus or 50 plus Raúles and Mabeles to vote for his party. So in the end, if you look at the total vote count, the La Libertad Avanza from Milei actually got a little bit more votes than in 2023. Peronism actually lost votes, not a whole lot, but it's their standard base. But the difference was so huge; it was like 14 points, and that basically was the pro vote missing that everybody had sort of counted in that was going to Milei. So it was kind of like a protest non-vote. It was also very, very low turnout. 63% only went to vote, and it's the lowest turnout of these kind of elections since democracy returned in '83. So it was really, really low. Normally, it's like 10 points higher. And yeah, the main thing is one of the reasons is because Kicillof, the governor, he decoupled the provincial elections from the national election. Normally, you vote everything together in one day, but he did that on purpose because it's kind of he knew that Peronists would be more prone to vote at a decoupling, and others might not. So all in all, the October elections will probably go a lot better because people will not vote Peronism. They will vote Milei, even if they don't really want to, the pro voters. And the turnout will just be way higher just because, it's national and not just provincial.
Sure.
But yeah,
So
it's
the big headlines were that the 14-15% loss by La Libertad Avanza, but in reality, that can be explained by dissension from the pro faction who had formed kind of a quasi coalition with LLA in terms of the 2023 national elections. This is for the province of Buenos Aires, not to be confused with the city of Buenos Aires. It is important because that's where most of the population in Argentina lives. This dissension, we believe, was caused more or less by Karina Millay not saying some unkind things towards the pro, and it does appear that she's kind of playing broker when it comes to candidacies, as you mentioned. And so I suppose when people saw some of the Kirchnerist candidates all of a sudden pretending to represent LLA or the pro coalition, people decided, you know what, we're just going to abstain. And that was enough to cause a 15% percentage point loss. Disastrous results, but we've got national midterms coming up in, I believe, November. Is that correct?
October
26th. What does that mean? What needs to change between now and October 2026? And does this mean the return of Caputo, who from the shadows?
Yeah. So, for those who don't know, Santiago Caputo is the nephew of the Minister of Economy, Luis Caputo. And he has been the main strategist behind the 2023 Milei campaign. He's been very successful at that. And he was kind of pushed aside in these elections by Karina Milei. And there were some talks that he would leave completely, but that would really be bad for Milei in general, just because he is one of those people that can really get all the younger voters together, especially the online community, the Millay trolls, as they call them. They are all in that little club, and they do exert a lot of influence online and really have had an influence on the election results in the presidential election. Now, it seems that they're back. He's back again for the national elections, the national midterms now in October. And to be fair, the candidates they can't be changed anymore, so they're already fixed. But those candidates for the national election, they are a lot better than the provincial ones. So we have people like Luis Espert and a couple of other ones that everybody knows them, and they will vote for them without thinking twice. And it was really a case of these provincial elections in Buenos Aires that there were a lot of people just like, who is this? They weren't well known, and just people were kind of reluctant to vote for these guys. So I think the midterms will go a lot better. That said, there is everybody's talking about it on X as well. Is kind of even like is hardcore followers. Everybody's like, dude, you have to change something inside the political structure because it's just rotten inside, especially with, his sister and Martin Menem and Lula Menem, which are basically all the Menem clan, the former president. They kind of wiggled their way into La Libertad Avanza, and they've set up a couple of kioscos there. And, the biggest one being the scandal of siphoning off percentages of the disability fund with Millei's sister. And it still has to be proven that those audios are correct, because it is Spagnola himself saying this. It's not them in a discussion or in a talk. So, it's basically, we have to trust that is true according to what he says. But, with all the raids, etc., there has been some evidence gathered, and now I think it was yesterday or the day before, one of a very high up guy, City Mido, who also was indicted by Brazil because he went after Lula and the election results against Bolsonaro. And he was basically indicted by Brazil by our Lord Voldemort there, the judge. But he's also very influential here. And he had to give testimony about those audios, and he basically said they were real, and confirmed that scheme, that he also heard those things.
Yeah,
And he's very close.
Diego Spagnuolo was in charge of allegedly collecting funds that are supposed to go to a national disability scheme in Argentina and skimming some of those. Apparently, there were some audio recordings of him explaining that part of that skim, let's call it, was to go to Karina Milei. For those of you who don't know, that's Javier Milei, the president of Argentina's sister, who is very influential in the party. Now, she seems to pop up quite a lot whenever there's a controversial moment. If we remember back to the last time we spoke about the Libra coin fiasco, there was speculation that she might have been essentially selling appointments with Javi and for every man and his dog to pitch some kind of scam. So have we heard the audios? Do they exist? Is there any kind of indictment or prosecution underway currently?
Well, yeah, a commission has been formed, and the commission is calling on Karina to give testimony, but it's all in those initial phases. So I think they can drag this out for quite a while if Milei doesn't want to fire her. But even tactically, I think they're doing a very poor job not reading the room, because basically Karina Milei has never been popular amongst the voter base. Not the La Libertad Avanza voter base, and basically no voter base at all. They measured her many times, and nobody wants to vote for her. And right now, she's still, on the campaign tour with provincial deputies that will be on the La Libertad Avanza lists for the national midterms. And in my opinion, that should be Milei, or somebody who's a little bit more popular, but not Menem and not Karina Milei. So yeah, they're getting a lot of backlash online. It's like, dudes, get your act together because this is not working. And it is good to see that that at least even the diehard base is not bootlicking and just swallowing it as it is. And oh yeah, now we're going to cheer for whatever. So that's a good criticism to see from that side. But yeah, we'll have to see how it turns out. I think that is overall a minor issue, which could potentially evolve into something way bigger when we have seen the peso devaluation basically over the last couple of days in reaction to the loss in the province. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
accelerating.
Before we move on to the economy, let's wrap this part of it up.
Mhm.
What is Karina's actual role inside the party, and what do you think the play is here? Is it the play just to bench her entirely, or to just kind of phase her out of camera view and bring Santiago back into business?
Well, that would be the smart thing to do, but they're not doing that. They're keeping her in the center of flyers and posters, etc. And she's even giving speeches now. So it's completely the opposite of what they should be doing. And so, yeah, I kind of have a hard feeling about that is going to turn out the way we want it to. But yeah, it's just the way it is.
Okay. Well, you mentioned you started to touch on the economy. So stocks took a hit in Argentina, and we also saw the country risk increase. And then, just like clockwork, our old friend Safety Namus comes out on Twitter and starts to critique Javier Milei, which obviously he doesn't need to be asked twice. He actually doesn't even need to be asked once in order to do that. So
It's all free.
we've got quite a lot of criticisms, which I read through. And I have to say, I am generally a fan of Safety when it comes to economic matters. And I'm
Hmm.
looking through what he's written, and his criticisms, I guess, in a nutshell, come down to the fact that Milei he was elected to stop inflation, and because inflation technically hasn't stopped yet, although it's come down from like 20% per month to just under or around 2% per month. And he also said he was going to abolish the central bank, and he hasn't done that, which, of course, he can't do that by presidential decree. We'll touch on that. What do you think are there any legitimate criticisms economically of the way Milei has acted in his first term? I mean, he has taken on more debt from the IMF. Some people say that
Hmm.
was completely necessary in order to roll over all the obligations. You mentioned a peso that has been devalued. The government has denied that, from what I understand. They say they're running a floating exchange operation. Let's start with the peso itself. Overvalued, undervalued, manipulated, not manipulated. What say you?
Yes, all of the above. So basically, it's still, I think actually right now it's still market value. The central bank has kind of stopped, and Treasury, they've stopped intervening in the FX markets. So technically, it's almost touching the upper band of the currency bands that were installed after the float. So we're almost there to see if they will intervene again. They have intervened heavily at the start when it really started running up across 1400 per dollar. But after that, they kind of let go because I think they're also seeing that they're running out of ammo if they keep doing this. So there's just so many maturities due next year, and that could potentially be a problem if they keep defending the peso. Which brings us to the bonds sell-off that has happened this week as well. Because of course, internationally, people are seeing this dynamic, and it could spiral out of control at some point if this keeps going on. Especially, we'll have to see what happens if it does touch the upper band, and yeah, if they really start intervening more heavily there. It's a really difficult situation to kind of think what's going to happen. But what I sense is going to happen, which always happens after elections, is that after elections they're just gonna let it run, because basically their main point to not let it run, because once it does, you get slammed with inflation again. So up until the elections, inflation, at least right now, there's actually deflation in basic goods this month so far, -2% almost. So that's very positive. And last month was 1.9, I believe. So I think this month will probably be around 1.5, something like that. And then once we get into October, they will want to keep that low And of course, once the midterms are over, then there's less pressure to, paint the picture the way it should be. So it could well be that they let the peso run. Then inflation comes back with a little bit of a vengeance, and then you have that little bump, and it drops again. But yeah, it all depends on those dynamics. It's like a very slippery slope. I wouldn't be long or caught in a carry trade right now, to be honest.
Okay, so you are the master of the carry trade. You're not going to be riding the financial bicycle, basically, which is what it's known in Argentina. When in order to make the peso more attractive, they had a bond auction, and oftentimes they just pay ridiculously high interest rates over and above the rate of inflation. So we're talking like 60-70% interest rates. And the game is to try and ride that out and then eventually get out before the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, and this was also one of the main criticisms by Seyfedin, saying like, yeah, they had a ridiculous bond auction of 69%, and it didn't even get filled completely, etc. But I think he's forgetting the Argentine dynamics is to unwind as much of peso carry trades possible before there's an election. And that process starts 3-4 months before, just because everybody knows it's going to be super turbulent and they just want to dollarize as much as they can. So it's also a kind of a point in time that he's picking. It has to do with a lot more things than just the economic situation. This is really preparing for the midterms, basically. And that's why it's more complicated to sell peso bonds, not because people are losing faith in the economic program per se.
Yeah, and is it fair to say that that might also be why JP Morgan no longer, or they pulled out of operating in Argentine bonds as of a couple of months ago, because they see this thing happening, rather than they are making a call necessarily on the Argentine economy? They're just looking, they know that there's midterms coming up and they don't want to deal with the volatility in the bond market.
Yeah, I mean, people close to me and myself, I did this as well. I had like, decent chunk in pesos running month to month. And I took everything out around, I think, when was it? Probably June, July, like around that time. But well, it's very stable. The dollar is cheap comparatively, and for me, it's okay. So I just took that out, and I haven't looked back, and that was a good decision. But you never know. But in Argentina, these things almost work like clockwork whenever it comes to elections. Just because everybody's so paranoid to lose out against the dollar that they start dollarizing.
Yeah, for sure. And let's talk about some of the other criticisms. We're talking about obviously not having shut down the central bank yet. And it seems to be framed as that it's been a renege on Millei's behalf of a campaign promise that he made. Talk me through what actually would need to happen in order for him to shut down the central bank, and instead the plan to get around that by making the central bank eventually irrelevant by encouraging competition of currency.
So yeah, the competition of currency, he already filed enough decrees for. Basically, it's you can pay anything in any kind of currency that you wish, and you can also pay taxes in other currencies if you want. The closing of the central bank, he would actually have to change the constitution for that. He would have to have an absolute majority in both chambers, which is it's just not gonna happen, not even after these midterms. So yeah, that's just kind of a lame criticism. I think it's more of like that's really an 8-year plan or longer. But what he could have done is dollarizing in some way, because then you miss out the whole foreign exchange dynamic, which we're dealing with now. But there weren't enough dollars to do that, and that's why he abandoned that plan too.
Yeah, and that's fair. Do you ever foresee a day where they may shut down the central bank?
I think that could only be done if he everything goes completely according to plan and he gets reelected in 2027. I don't see that. That's definitely not going to happen this mandate.
For sure. And in terms of the dynamic of using the central bank's assets to prop up the peso, essentially, I guess there is cause for some concern, because we were criticizing Lula doing that last year over in Brazil. And it's kind of straight out of the Kirchner's playbook.
Yes.
But are you saying that it's a short-term measure in order to provide some stability within that range, acceptable range, before the midterms, so that things don't spiral out of control? And then once we're past the midterms, that there might be a little more room to run to the upside.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I think. But it's always a dangerous game to play, and every single administration has done this. Also during Macri, they're always, trying to fight the devaluation of the peso, which, is burning up reserves.
Yeah. It's certainly something to watch. Any other points that you wanted to make around the perceived weaknesses or criticisms of the current economic policy being run in
Well,
Argentina?
I think
Anything that
it's
you would like to see different?
one of the things
We're
that
trying to get a sense of what's fair
kind of
and what's
stuck
not
with
fair
me.
in terms of the criticisms.
Yeah, is I think the overall debt is actually decreased if you look at it.
Yes, that's a very good point. Explain the dynamics behind that.
Yeah, so of course Milei took on more IMF debt. He used that debt also to pay off other maturities. Besides that, there was a lot of peso debt accumulated by Massa before he became president. So Milei had to deal with all that, and they have gotten rid of a big chunk of that debt as well. They consolidated all the debt in the treasury, and I think in his previous criticisms, he didn't even take that into account, Seyfedin. So he was just like, "Oh yeah, so look at all this," and he didn't even, look at the consolidated picture or didn't understand that had to happen. So it was like, "Oh yeah, now suddenly the debt is so much higher in Treasury." It's like, no, because that's
It's just been moved from the
it's
central
just been
bank.
moved. Yeah, exactly.
Pretty easy to understand.
Yeah. So I think that's I don't have the exact numbers now, but that was one of the things that stood out, where overall debt has actually decreased. So it's not the end of the world the way they managed that. I think it's one of the only ways they could have done so.
Interesting. Zooming out just a little bit now, we touched on Lord Voldemort across the border. Broader LATAM trends, there seems to be a kind of a new wave of reformers. Looks like Peru have decided they're going to have somewhat of a Milei moment. Your mate Alexandre de Moraes made headlines this week sentencing former President Jair Bolsonaro to 27 years behind bars. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Talk us through the dynamic of what's happening over the other side of the Rio de la.
Well, it's basically to cancel him out completely before the elections, and make sure that he doesn't become active politically again, because they're just pinning a kind of January 6th on him, as they did with Trump, condemning him because he sort of incited a revolt against Congress in Brasilia after the elections because he didn't accept the election results, etc. It's basically the same, exactly a carbon copy of what happened in the U.S. And it went out of hand, and people started trashing the building, etc. But those people, they all went to jail. But the Bolsonaro trial lasted a little bit longer. And basically, what I think is going to happen is that the U.S. will take some kind of measures against Brazil for this, just because it's really a political move. Now, of course, a lot of people here in Argentina, pro Cristina, started saying, "Well, yeah, it's the same that they did with Cristina, and maybe they should do a swap or whatever and get them both free." But yeah, it's not exactly the same, guys. But yeah, it's it's hard to explain that to them.
I didn't even know what to say to that. That's completely
No, but
not even in the same universe.
no, exactly. But yeah, my thinking is there that the U.S. will definitely retaliate because, of course, Bolsonaro is a buddy of Trump, but also just because this Lord Voldemort, Alexandre de Moraes, he's just been doing all sorts of interventions into the democracy basically, and he's just running the country almost. It's really crazy.
He is. He's a shadow dictator. He's a Supreme Court justice, right? That's what he
Yeah.
is.
Yes, that's what he is.
Yeah.
So,
And he was
yeah.
involved in the Twitter ban from last year. Where
Exactly. Yeah, he was involved in fining Elon Musk and shutting down Twitter, shutting down other businesses, etc. So yeah, he's really running the show, and yeah. So I think that will definitely have consequences for Brazil. Also, because the U.S. is way more focused on the Western Hemisphere. I mean, there's really a Monroe Doctrine 2.0 going on with Venezuela, with Mexico, with Brazil. And I think basically the countries who are not going to play ball, they're going to have a really hard time. You can see all sorts of favors raining down on Argentina because Milei is such big buddies with Trump. And I think for anybody in line with Trump's vision or more friends with the U.S., they're going to be, given kind of advantages, and other countries are not. And yeah, in the case of Venezuela, I can completely understand that whole situation. I don't think they will invade, but I just think they will cut off most of Maduro's funding, besides oil, to fund his little narco empire, and make it really hard for him to pay all of these armed militia that he has and the army, and then hope that they will take action. But I don't think they're actually going to invade Venezuela and do it themselves. They're probably going to wait it out and bleed it to death slowly.
Yeah, it seems to be a siege strategy, especially cutting off narco boats moving around the Caribbean. Venezuela seems to me to be a bit more tricky to get boots on the ground, like Panama in the whole
Yeah.
Noriego days. But it'll be interesting to watch play out. I think when you look at, okay, who's Maduro's funding supplies, obviously through the narcotics, then you've got, okay, who's selling him the arms? And is it Russia that seems to be, and Iran even? Because Venezuela had quite a lot of terrorist
Yeah, yeah.
hotbeds associated.
Yeah, Russia, Iran, China, I'm not really sure, but I do think they're also involved. And I think the main goal, but besides, of course, Trump, it's just going to be a longer term strategy to get back to the Western Hemisphere control, because I think China has gotten way too much influence in South America, and I think they want to get kind of rid of that. So when I read about a bio-oceanic train that has been proposed multiple times in the last 2 decades from Brazil to Peru being funded by China, that's probably not going to happen. I really don't think that will happen. Besides the costs and how long it will take in Latin America, just imagine. I just don't think the U.S. will let that happen, so that exports can reach China more easily.
It's true. In terms of what the US can do with regards to the Bolsonaro Brazil situation, apart from tariffs, what else can they really do in terms of helping out this kind of, I guess,
Well, I
or
mean,
help fight this anti freedom? Because the more tariffs they put on, the more they kind of drive Brazil over towards the BRICS nation, which now include, well, Brazil is the B in BRICS, right?
yeah. No, I think the tariff story is done with Brazil, and and of course that was all political because Brazil had a surplus with Brazil, so it didn't make any sense from a trade perspective. But I think they will double down on sanctions, and it could be they already sanctioned the Moraes personally, so basically he cannot have any banking, on the SWIFT network, etc. All his bank accounts in the West have been shut down. In Brazil, banks have been reluctant to do so, of course, because otherwise they could run into trouble. But at a certain point, I think they could start pressing. Well, if they are still servicing the Moraes, then we're going to cut them off from the SWIFT network or something. Pretty much like a Russia kind of, okay, we're going to freeze all your treasury bills, something like that. I could see happening.
Okay, that's interesting. In terms of Brazil's financial situation with the US, do they hold a lot of treasuries? The Brazilian central bank tends to run rates higher than the rate of inflation normally.
Yes. Well, the last time I think it was already a year ago that I checked. Despite having most of the trade with China, Brazilian central bank was still 80% in dollars. So in terms of foreign reserves, so they do hold most in dollars still.
Well, that's going to hurt if they
Yes.
if they have access to their treasuries. Let's just say made more scarcely available. Let's get practical in terms of lifestyle, mate. So you've been around the world, you've seen it all, and you're one of the OGs. And you and I are working together on a Maverick Life project, which is funding your freedom and sovereignty. Oftentimes that involves mobility. This is not the same as a broke mad life where you're only going where you can afford because it's cheap and you don't want to do something useful like work a job. But some of the usual suspects seem to be taken off the board now. Like Argentina is getting more expensive. People are trying to find some other, I would suggest, more risky places to try and live. If you were starting out again, where would you go and what would you do in terms of funding an individual sovereign lifestyle?
Well, I would just go somewhere that I would like to live, not so much because it would be cheap or tax advantageous. Taxes only become a problem once you have enough income, basically. And there's a lot of people that make a couple $100 and start worrying about the tax man. I always say, dude, once you get over a couple hundred grand, then you start worrying about the tax man. But yeah, no, I would just basically, if you're starting out really from scratch, I would focus on the business and making money. And I think that's the number one thing that, people always try to save more or be super frugal and basically have a shitty lifestyle and not spend anything. But you just need more income. And I'm not saying, of course, that once you get more income you should spend it all by buying expensive cars, etc. No, just like live a normal life, but do focus on generating more and more income streams from different sources of income as well. I think a lot of people really are super dependent on one source of income, and once that drops, then yeah, it can be really hard to replace that.
Yeah, for sure. And we're coming into this, I guess, this new age, really, in terms of what artificial intelligence, which is really still only high computing technology, what it can do. What do you think is going to happen to the remote creator economy that had a, had a good little run after COVID and all that sort of thing, and people were thinking this was going to be the new middle class? How do you see that impacting this kind of creator economy, let's call it?
Well, I still think that's going to exist. It's just going to be a lot less people, and people that know how to use AI really well to be more productive and have better output, basically. So I think it's just going to be a few people really getting paid not super high salaries, maybe depending on if they're working on in a company, or if they're solo entrepreneurs and doing it themselves. Because the problem here is also with all these companies in India, etc. The services are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Of course, the quality is not always there, but there's a bunch of people that don't really care about that, and it does drive prices down across the board. Now, living in Argentina, you can already be a little bit cheaper, but I still think if people focus on quality and create a good track record and can show ROI, basically, if you're depending on what sector you're in, but if you're in marketing, like me, then I think showing ROI and actually having some numbers in front of companies goes a long way if you have that track record.
Yeah, for sure. That's why we're on the ROI channel right now, my friend. In terms of the geosphere, taxes, passports, residencies, style, safety, all that kind of thing, where do you think, off the top of your head, if we scan the globe, where do you think are still some reasonable pockets of value? Obviously, we've spoken about the Southern Cone. Do you see any new up and coming areas of the globe that might be that might provide?
Well, I think Eastern Europe is, well, everything depends on the war, of course. But, if taking that out of the equation, that would be an interesting region, I think, with a lot of things happening. Otherwise, I just, I'm such a Latin America fan. I wouldn't leave Latin America, to be honest. I think there's probably some pockets in Asia as well. I just don't really know enough about it. And I think in most African countries, I would just feel too much of an outsider there to really move around freely like I would here.
Yeah, for sure. Out of all your time spent traveling around the world, do you have a funny failure moment that you look back now and you laugh that you think might be constructive?
Well, I posted about this the other day. It's not so much a failure moment. It was more a personal moment. But no, you can run into really weird situations, especially if you settle in Latin America. So I was on a trip to Sao Paulo to meet my future family-in-law. And so it was the first time I would meet them. I met my now ex-wife in the Netherlands. We lived together there for a while, and after a couple months, we decided to get married. Early 20s, do some crazy stuff. But at the same time, I had a Dutch Brazilian friend. He was on the ground in Sao Paulo, and I had let him know, I'll be there in a couple of weeks. Here's some friends, talk to them. And I also hooked him up with one of my ex flings from Spain who was living in Sao Paulo. She was Brazilian. And this guy thought it was a good idea to meet me up at the airport while my mother-in-law was there. My future mother-in-law was there waiting for me. She had never met me before. So he was standing there with this fling and my future mother-in-law, and I had no idea because this fucker didn't tell me about it. So I arrived there and I was like, what are you doing here? What's she doing here? And then and I was just, I wanted to meet my future mother-in-law and I didn't want to deal with this shit. But then, like, the mother-in-law was, oh yeah, we had a chat. Like, they could all come over to my place, and we just everybody went over, and it was just so uncomfortable. But yeah, that kind of stuff can happen. And in terms of business-wise, what can happen is that you really decide to go and start a local company. Depending on the country, I would never do that. Just make sure everything is online, is in a good jurisdiction. Do a US LLC or something. It's very easy. You can set everything up online. You don't have to travel to the US to do that. Those are all things that would have been super helpful for me to know before, going through all the other pain points of local companies, etc. So I think, that's something that I would, tell most people, just set it up in the US and then work from there as a single member LLC. You don't have to pay taxes in the US if you're not a resident. It's a flow through structure. So, you're responsible, and that income, you can just file that wherever you live or where you're a tax resident.
And do you offer people help in terms of setting those entities up?
Myself, no, but I do work with people who are specialized in that and in taxes, international taxes.
Okay, so you can put people in
Yeah.
touch with the appropriate person. Mate, contrarian take right now, and because, we're all guilty, we kind of get into our own little ecosystem where the thought process is somewhat of an echo chamber. Have you got a contrarian take on anything right now that you think it would be interesting to bring to the fore?
Well, by now I think it's kind of consensus, but that's probably also the little bubble online that I live in. I think we're going to have a good Q4 run up in terms of Bitcoin, crypto, that segment, and probably in 2026 I see a lot of those things and tech going down. And in the meantime, I'm just diversifying into commodities because I think we're ripe for another commodity cycle. And I'm focusing a lot in terms of country plays, in investments. I'm focusing on Colombia and Brazil. I think those two, since they have elections in 2026, I think they could offer some surprises. And there's still really good valuations on most companies.
Yeah, so you're expecting a change of regime in those two
Yeah.
countries? Interesting. In terms of the crypto cycle, are we talking the power law where that generally follows the halving, and you've gone from kind of like the Bitcoin to Ethereum to the altcoins? What do you think we can hit in terms of a top for Bitcoin? And then where do you think the drawdown might get to if this cycle plays out similar to previous cycles?
Well, it always goes hand in hand with liquidity. And from what I'm seeing, at least in a couple of different places, is that liquidity is going to start topping out in Q4 at some point. Of course, it all depends on what will happen eventually, but that is kind of the estimate right now. I think, according to the power law, we're exactly at the point where Bitcoin price should be. I think it can probably run up to, at the end of the year, it should be around 125. That's like the mean for the power law. We're already, we already went over and now back, so we're still on track. I think, with the right amount of liquidity and bullishness, it could go to 150, 170. I don't really see it going to, 200 or more, but it could spike there. But if it gets there, I'll probably be a net seller at that point with my trading position because I also have long-term cold storage that I just never touch. And then I could see a pretty brutal bear market with all these Bitcoin treasury companies just going bust one after the other, and it's going to be cascading effect because that's Ponzi dynamics. There are just like anything besides MicroStrategy, I think is going to have a really hard time not selling their Bitcoin in a bear market.
Yeah. So you think, I think it's the writing's almost on the wall. A lot of people are saying these Bitcoin treasuries will revert to their intrinsic value, which is whatever Bitcoin they have, but then they got overhead. So they're going to have to sell this
Hmm.
Bitcoin eventually.
Yeah.
How much Bitcoin would that be? And can the market absorb it? Or do you think it's just going to tank the price and we have a 20, 30, 50, 80% correction in the Bitcoin price?
Yeah. It really all depends on the passive flows in the ETFs, basically, because right now, the ETFs and the treasury companies are moving the market, mostly. I don't think, depending on what happens, of course, but I don't think we're going to get to 80% drawdowns anymore. But I could see a situation where we get to 100K again.
And you think that might be the max drawdown because
Yeah,
now we have
maybe.
more institutional holders. Is that why?
Yeah, well, I'm talking, of course, after getting to 170. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So not now, but over time, once it gets to that top, then I could see it, going down to 190, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. In wrapping up, mates, what's it like? I'll be catching up with you in December back in BA. What's the mood on the street like? What's happening there? The usual chaos. Have you felt a change since the new administration generally? Because I did. I felt the vibe was different on the street last time I
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah, the vibe is definitely different. There's a lot less people in restaurants and bars, so it has definitely slowed down. But also at the same time, people are buying more expensive goods instead of spending all their last pesos in restaurants. But also combined with the fact that restaurants have become like pretty expensive, people are just not going out as much as before.
Real estate market update. Are we good value or are we starting to get a little bit toppy?
No, no, the valuations are still very low, especially for used properties. So there, it kind of depends on the mortgages. It was all bullish up until September. There was like a big month-over-month increase in terms of mortgages. But the last couple of months were already driven mainly by Banco La Nación. And the problem there is that Banco Ciudad and Banco La Nación are two public banks, basically, and have a large public stake, and they were able to offer very low rates compared to other banks. Basically, most commercial banks were in the 8+% plus the UVA rate. So you could really get into trouble there if you take a mortgage like that, because UVA is basically the unit of account that adjusts with the construction inflation over time. So basically, you take a loan in UVAs, and that loan, the amount gets bigger based on the construction inflation, and on top of that, you have the bank interest. So that could spiral out of control if that's above 5%. But yeah, those two banks were still offering 4 or 5%, so that was decent. But since September, and the majority of loans were signed off by those two banks. And then since September, they are starting to request very high credit scores, which are very hard to get, almost impossible. Basically, you need already to have one of these loans paid off, or a lot of loans, etc. And usually people who want to buy their first home, they don't have that. So I suspect that the drop off is going to be pretty brutal in September in terms of mortgages issued. And yeah, depending on the climate, that could or could not continue. And that could really stall the price of used properties.
Interesting. I'll be keeping an eye out on that for sure. All right, guys, if you want to get in touch with the Bowtie Admirer, the links to his Substack and agency contact details will be in the description. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to catching up with you in another episode shortly on the ROI channel. Take care.